sinking in the rapids. She had no hope, until a prisoner freed himself and rescued her. What would you do if you were drowning in freezing water, your lungs burning, your arms too weak to fight the current, and the only person close enough to save you was a man in handcuffs? A man the world had already judged and thrown away. Most people would never expect a prisoner to risk his own life for a stranger. Most people would never believe that a man in chains could become someone's only chance at survival. But life has a strange way of proving us wrong. Sometimes the hero doesn't wear a cape. Sometimes the hero wears an orange jumpsuit. And sometimes the moment that changes, everything happens in the last few seconds before it's too late. This is not a made-up story. This is not something pulled from a movie script. This actually happened. And by the end of it, you will question everything you thought you knew about who deserves a second chance. The morning of June 14 started like any other summer day in the small town of Maple Creek, nestled along the edge of the Clearwater River in the mountainous region of northern Oregon. The sky was a soft blue, painted with thin white clouds that moved slowly across the horizon. The air was warm but not yet heavy with the heat that usually settled in by the afternoon. Birds called out from the tall pine trees that lined both sides of the river, and the smell of damp earth and fresh water filled every breath. Rachel Meadows woke up early that morning. She had planned this trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, a day to get away from the noise and stress of her life back in Portland. She was 32 years old, a schoolteacher who had spent the last year going through one of the hardest periods of her life. A painful divorce, a custody battle over her two young children, sleepless nights, tear-filled mornings. Her best friend, Dana, had been the one to suggest the river trip. Dana had told her that the fresh air and the sound of the water would do her some good. Rachel had hesitated at first. She was not an experienced kayaker. She had only been on calm water a few times before, years ago during a college camping trip. But Dana had insisted. She said the section of the river they were going to was gentle, mostly flat water with a few easy turns. Nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about. Rachel packed her things the night before. A small waterproof bag with her phone, a bottle of water, some snacks, sunscreen, and a change of clothes. She wore a light blue tank top, shorts, and water shoes. She did not bring a life jacket of her own because Dana had told her the rental company would provide one. She kissed her children goodbye that morning at her mother's house, where they were staying for the weekend. Her daughter, Lily, who was 6, hugged her tight and told her to be careful. Her son, James, who was 4, barely looked up from his cereal. Rachel smiled and told them she would be back before dinner. She drove an hour and a half from Portland to the river access point near Maple Creek. The drive was quiet and beautiful. The highway curved through dense forests and over small bridges that crossed narrow streams. Rachel played soft music on the radio and let her mind drift. She thought about how much had changed in such a short time. A year ago, she had been married, living in a house with a yard, planning family vacations, and feeling like her life was on a steady path. Now, everything was different. She lived in a small apartment. She shared her children with a man who barely spoke to her. She went to therapy every Tuesday evening. She cried more than she wanted to admit, but she was trying. She was trying to rebuild something. And today was supposed to be one small step in that direction. When she arrived at the river access point, Dana was already there, standing beside 2 rented kayaks. Dana was tall, with short brown hair and a wide smile that always made Rachel feel a little better. They hugged and laughed and talked about how perfect the weather was. The rental company had set up a small station near the riverbank. A young man in a baseball cap handed them paddles and life jackets. Rachel's life jacket was a faded orange color and felt a little loose around her chest, but she didn't think much of it. She tightened the straps as best she could and climbed into the yellow kayak. Dana climbed into the red one. They pushed off from the bank and began paddling slowly downstream. For the first hour, everything was exactly what Dana had promised. The water was calm and clear. Rachel could see smooth rocks on the riverbed below. Fish darted in and out of the shadows. The trees on either side of the river leaned over the water like they were trying to listen to something. Rachel felt her shoulders relax for the first time in months. She breathed deeply. She smiled. She even laughed when Dana splashed her with a paddle. It felt like the old days, before everything fell apart, before the lawyers and the court dates and the loneliness. For that 1 hour, Rachel felt like herself again. But the river, like life, does not stay the same for long. About 2 miles downstream from where they had started, the river began to change. The water moved faster. The surface, which had been smooth and glassy, started to ripple and churn. Small waves appeared, slapping against the sides of the kayaks. Rachel noticed it first. She looked ahead and saw the river narrowing between two large rock formations. The water squeezed through the gap and dropped slightly, creating a stretch of whitewater rapids that she had not expected. Her grip tightened on the paddle. Her heart began to beat faster. Dana, who was a few yards ahead, looked back and shouted something, but Rachel could not hear her clearly over the growing sound of the water. Dana pointed to the right side of the river, where the current seemed a little calmer, and gestured for Rachel to follow. Rachel tried to steer her kayak to the right, but the current was strong. It pulled her toward the center of the river where the water was the roughest. She paddled hard, her arms burning with the effort, but the kayak did not respond the way she wanted it to. Then it happened. A wave hit the left side of her kayak and tipped it sharply. Rachel leaned to the right to balance, but another wave came from the other direction. The kayak flipped. In one terrifying second, Rachel was underwater. The cold hit her like a punch to the chest. She gasped and water rushed into her mouth. She kicked and thrashed, trying to get her head above the surface. When she finally broke through, she coughed and spit water and reached for the kayak. But it was already spinning away from her downstream. The life jacket should have kept her floating, but it was too loose. It had ridden up around her neck and was not doing its job properly. Instead of holding her body above the water, it was pressing against her chin and making it harder to breathe. Rachel tried to tighten it, but her hands were shaking and the current kept pulling her under. She screamed for Dana, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the rapids. Dana had already passed through the narrow section and was on the other side, in calmer water. She turned around and saw Rachel struggling. Her face went white. She tried to paddle back upstream, but the current was too strong. She screamed Rachel's name over and over, but there was nothing she could do from where she was. She pulled out her phone and called 911 with trembling hands. Rachel was being carried downstream at a speed she could not control. The water tossed her body like it was nothing. She hit a rock with her shoulder and cried out in pain. She hit another rock with her hip. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but the rocks were slippery and the water was too fast. She could feel her energy draining. Her arms felt heavy. Her legs were going numb from the cold. She thought about her children. She thought about Lily's face that morning when she hugged her. She thought about James sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal without a care in the world. The thought of never seeing them again filled her with a terror that was worse than the water itself. About a quarter-mile downstream from where Rachel had flipped, the river curved sharply to the left. On the right side of that curve, there was a flat, rocky bank where the county had built a small rest area with picnic tables and a gravel parking lot. That rest area was used by hikers, fishermen, and sometimes by county vehicles. On that particular morning, it was being used for something else entirely. A white transport van with the words Clearwater County Corrections printed on the side was parked in the gravel lot. Inside that van, 5 minutes earlier, had been 6 inmates from the county jail. They were part of a supervised work crew that cleaned up public areas along the river as part of a community service program. The inmates wore orange jumpsuits and were supervised by 2 armed correctional officers. Their hands were cuffed in front of them with standard-issue metal handcuffs, and their ankles were free so they could walk and work. The crew had been picking up trash along the riverbank when they heard the screaming. At first, no one could tell where it was coming from. The sound of the rapids was loud enough to drown out most other noise. But one of the inmates, a man named Marcus Cole, stopped what he was doing and looked toward the water. He was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and deep brown eyes that carried a kind of quiet intensity. Marcus was serving an 18-month sentence for a non-violent drug offense. He had been arrested the previous year for possession with intent to distribute. It was not his first time in trouble with the law. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood in southeast Portland, raised by a grandmother who did her best but could not shield him from everything the streets had to offer. He had made mistakes, many of them. He knew that. But he also knew that the mistakes he had made did not erase the person he was underneath them. Marcus saw her before anyone else did, a woman, barely keeping her head above the water, being swept around the bend in the river. Her arms were flailing, her mouth was open, but no sound was coming out anymore. She was maybe 50 yards upstream and closing fast. Marcus did not think. He did not calculate the risks. He did not weigh the consequences. He dropped the trash bag he was holding, turned to the nearest correctional officer, a man named Deputy Harris, and said 3 words that would change everything. "She's going to die." Deputy Harris looked at the water and saw Rachel. His face tightened. He reached for his radio to call for help, but Marcus was already moving. With his hands still cuffed together, Marcus ran toward the riverbank. Deputy Harris shouted at him to stop. The other officer, Deputy Wells, stepped forward and put a hand on his holster, but Marcus did not stop. He could not stop. He had seen the look on that woman's face. He had seen the way her body was going limp. He knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep inside him, that if he waited even 30 more seconds, she would go under and she would not come back up. Marcus reached the edge of the bank and jumped into the river. The cold water hit him hard, but he was a strong man and he had grown up swimming in rivers and lakes during the summers of his childhood. His grandmother used to take him to a swimming hole near their house, and he had spent hours in the water as a boy. That memory, buried under years of bad choices and hard living, came back to him in an instant. His body remembered what to do even when his mind was racing with fear. The handcuffs made everything harder. He could not separate his hands to do a proper swimming stroke. Instead, he kept his wrists together and used his arms like a single paddle, pushing through the water with raw power. His legs kicked hard beneath him. The current tried to pull him sideways, but he fought it. He kept his eyes locked on Rachel, who was now only about 20 yards away. Her head dipped below the surface. It came back up. It dipped again. Each time she went under. She stayed down a little longer. Marcus pushed harder. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned from the cold air and the effort. Water splashed into his face and blurred his vision. But he kept going. He closed the distance yard by yard, stroke by stroke. When he was close enough, he reached out with both cuffed hands and grabbed the strap of her life jacket. He pulled her toward him with everything he had. Rachel's eyes were half closed. Her skin was pale. She coughed weakly and tried to speak, but no words came out. Marcus wrapped his cuffed arms around her chest from behind and kicked toward the bank. The current fought him every inch of the way. It pushed them downstream, past the rest area, past the picnic tables, past the parked transport van. Deputy Harris and Deputy Wells ran along the bank, shouting instructions, but Marcus could barely hear them. All he could hear was the water and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. All he could feel was the weight of the woman in his arms and the desperate need to get her to solid ground. About 40 yards downstream from the rest area, there was a section of the bank where the rocks gave way to a small patch of sandy ground. Marcus aimed for it. He kicked and pulled and fought the current with every ounce of strength he had left. His foot touched the bottom, then his knee. He dragged Rachel through the shallow water and onto the sand. He collapsed beside her, gasping for air, his chest heaving, his cuffed hands shaking. Rachel lay on her back, coughing up water. Her eyes opened slowly. She looked up at the sky, then turned her head and saw Marcus lying next to her. She saw the orange jumpsuit. She saw the handcuffs. And in that moment, none of it mattered. She reached out with one trembling hand and grabbed his arm. She could not speak. She did not need to. The look in her eyes said everything. Deputy Harris and Deputy Wells reached them moments later. Deputy Harris knelt beside Rachel and checked her breathing. Deputy Wells stood over Marcus with a complicated expression on his face. He looked at the handcuffs still locked around Marcus's wrists, and then at the woman whose life Marcus had just saved. For a long moment, no one said anything. The only sound was the river, still rushing past them, indifferent to what had just happened on its banks. An ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. The paramedics wrapped Rachel in a thermal blanket and checked her vital signs. She had swallowed a significant amount of water and her body temperature had dropped, but she was alive. She was conscious. She was breathing. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, she looked back toward the sandy bank where Marcus was sitting, still in his wet orange jumpsuit, still in his handcuffs, watching her with those quiet, deep eyes. She mouthed 2 words to him before the ambulance doors closed. "Thank you." Marcus nodded. Then he looked down at his cuffed hands and said nothing. The other inmates stood in a loose group near the transport van, watching everything in silence. None of them had moved when Marcus jumped in, not because they did not care, but because they had been too shocked to react. One of them, a younger man named Terrell, shook his head slowly and said under his breath, "That man is something else." Deputy Harris walked back to Marcus and stood in front of him for a moment. He did not say anything right away. He just looked at him. Then he reached down and offered Marcus his hand. Marcus looked at it, then looked up at the deputy's face. He took the hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. "You could have drowned," Deputy Harris said. "So could she," Marcus replied. Deputy Harris nodded slowly. He reached for his radio and reported what had happened. He described the rescue in plain, factual terms. But even through the static and the official language, there was something in his voice that gave away what he was feeling. Something that sounded like respect. The crew was loaded back into the transport van. The doors were closed. The van pulled out of the gravel lot and headed back toward the county jail. Marcus sat in his seat by the window, still dripping wet, still shivering slightly from the cold. He stared out the window at the river as it grew smaller in the distance. He did not say a word the entire ride back. But inside his chest, something had shifted. Something that had been heavy and dark for a very long time felt a little bit lighter. He did not know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. And so was hers. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the rescue, a local reporter from the Maple Creek Gazette had picked up the story from the emergency dispatch log. The headline read, "Inmate jumps into river to save drowning woman." By the next morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets in Portland and Salem. By the following evening, it was national. Television crews showed up at the Clearwater County Jail asking for interviews. Journalists called the county sheriff's office looking for details. Social media exploded with opinions. Some people called Marcus a hero. Others questioned why a prisoner had been anywhere near a public river in the first place. A few even suggested the whole thing was staged for attention. But the people who were there that day, the deputies, the other inmates, the paramedics, and most importantly, Rachel Meadows, knew exactly what had happened. There was nothing fake about it. A woman had been seconds from death and a man in handcuffs had risked his own life to pull her out. Rachel spent 2 nights in the hospital. The doctors told her she had been extremely lucky. She had swallowed enough water to cause aspiration, and her core body temperature had dropped to a level that could have caused cardiac arrest if she had stayed in the river much longer. She had bruises on her shoulder, her hip, and her left knee from hitting the rocks. Her throat was raw from coughing and from the river water that had forced its way into her lungs. But she was alive. That fact kept repeating in her mind like a drumbeat. She was alive. She was alive because a stranger, a man she had never met, a man the system had labeled as a criminal, had thrown himself into the same water that was killing her and had refused to let her go. Dana came to visit her in the hospital that first evening. She walked into the room with red eyes and trembling hands and sat beside Rachel's bed without saying anything for a long time. Then she started crying. She told Rachel she was sorry. She said she should have checked the river conditions more carefully. She said she should have made sure the life jacket fit properly. She said she would never forgive herself. Rachel reached out and held Dana's hand and told her it was not her fault. She told her the river was unpredictable. She told her that no one could have known what would happen. But even as she said those words, Rachel's mind was somewhere else. It was back on that sandy bank, looking at a man in an orange jumpsuit with water dripping from his face and chains on his wrists. She could not stop thinking about him. On her second night in the hospital, Rachel asked the nurse if she could use the television in her room. She flipped through the channels and found a local news station running the story. They showed footage of the river, the rest area, and the transport van. They showed a photograph of Marcus Cole that had been taken from his booking record. He looked different in the photo than he had looked on the riverbank. In the photo, his expression was flat and tired, the way people look when they have given up on something. On the riverbank, his expression had been something else entirely. It had been fierce and determined and alive. Rachel stared at the screen and felt a deep, aching gratitude that she could not put into words. When she was released from the hospital, Rachel went home to her apartment in Portland. Her mother brought the children over, and Rachel held them so tightly that Lily laughed and said she couldn't breathe. James climbed into her lap and fell asleep within minutes, his small, warm body curled against her chest. Rachel sat on the couch with both of her children pressed against her and cried silently. She cried because she had almost lost them. She cried because someone she did not know had given her back the chance to hold them again. And she cried because she did not know how to repay something like that. Over the next few days, Rachel became consumed with the need to find out more about Marcus Cole. She searched his name online and found the news articles about the rescue. She found a few older articles about his arrest and his sentencing. She learned that he had grown up in Portland. She learned that his grandmother, a woman named Loretta Cole, had raised him after his mother left when he was 3 years old. She learned that he had been a talented athlete in high school, a running back on the football team who had been scouted by 2 colleges before he tore his knee ligament in his senior year. She learned that after the injury, he had fallen into a crowd that led him to the streets, and the streets had led him to drugs, and the drugs had led him to a series of arrests that stretched across more than a decade of his life. But she also found something else. In one of the articles, a reporter had interviewed a woman who worked at a community center in southeast Portland. The woman said that Marcus had volunteered at the center several times before his most recent arrest. He had helped organize a basketball tournament for neighborhood kids. He had donated coats during the winter. He had spent Saturday mornings teaching young boys how to change a tire and how to cook basic meals. The woman described him as quiet, polite, and deeply kind. She said the neighborhood had lost something when he went to jail. Rachel read that article 3 times, then she closed her laptop and made a decision. She was going to visit him. It took Rachel nearly a week to figure out the process for visiting an inmate at Clearwater County Jail. She had never been inside a jail before. She had never even known anyone who had been arrested. The world Marcus came from was completely foreign to her. She grew up in a middle-class suburb with 2 parents who were still married. She went to college. She became a teacher. Her biggest brush with the law had been a speeding ticket on the highway 5 years ago. The idea of walking into a correctional facility made her nervous in a way she had not expected, but the need to say thank you in person was stronger than her fear. He filled out the visitor request form online and waited for approval. 3 days later, she received an email confirming that her visit had been approved for the following Saturday at 10 in the morning. She told Dana about her plan. Dana raised her eyebrows and asked if she was sure. Rachel said she was. Dana offered to come with her, but Rachel said she wanted to go alone. This felt personal. It felt like something she needed to do by herself. Saturday morning came with grey skies and a light rain. Rachel dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans. She drove the hour and a half to Clearwater County in silence. The building was a squat, concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looked cold and hard and unwelcoming. She sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes before she found the courage to get out of the car. Inside, she went through a security check. She placed her personal items in a locker. She walked through a metal detector. A female officer patted her down and checked her identification. Then she was led through a heavy steel door and down a long hallway with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and something else, something stale and closed in, like air that had not moved in a long time. She was taken to a visitation room with a row of small tables and plastic chairs. The walls were painted a dull beige. A guard stood in the corner with his arms crossed. Rachel sat down at one of the tables and waited. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. She did not know what she was going to say. She had rehearsed a few sentences in her head during the drive, but now that she was here, all of those sentences seemed small and inadequate. A door on the far side of the room opened and Marcus walked in. He looked different from the last time she had seen him. He was dry, for one thing. His orange jumpsuit was clean and pressed. His handcuffs had been removed for the visit. He was taller than she remembered, and broader. His shaved head caught the light from the fluorescent bulbs. His expression was guarded, the way a person looks when they have learned not to expect good things. He sat down across from her and placed his hands flat on the table. He did not speak first. Rachel opened her mouth and immediately felt tears rising in her eyes. She had not planned to cry. She had told herself she would be composed and strong. But sitting across from the man who had saved her life, the man who had jumped into a freezing river with chains on his wrists, the man who had wrapped his arms around her and fought the current when she had already given up, she could not hold it together. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Rachel said. "You saved my life. You could have died." Marcus shrugged slightly, not in a way that was dismissive, but in a way that suggested he had not thought of it in those terms. "I saw you in the water," he said. "I couldn't just stand there." Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "The deputies told me you didn't even hesitate. They said you just ran and jumped in. I've done a lot of things in my life that I'm not proud of," he said, "but standing by while someone drowns was never going to be one of them." They talked for nearly an hour. The conversation started slowly, carefully, like two people walking across a frozen lake, testing each step before putting their full weight down. Rachel told him about her children. She showed him a small photograph of Lily and James that she had been allowed to bring in. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time and then smiled, and when he smiled, the guarded look on his face disappeared completely, and Rachel could see the person underneath. She could see the boy who had played football and volunteered at the community center and taught kids how to cook. Marcus told her about his grandmother. He spoke about Loretta Cole with a tenderness that surprised Rachel. He said she was the only person who had ever truly believed in him. She had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over his head. She had walked him to school every morning until he was old enough to go alone. She had sat in the front row at every one of his football games, even the ones played in the pouring rain, cheering louder than anyone else in the stands. When he had gotten into trouble the first time, she had not yelled or lectured. She had sat him down at the kitchen table and told him she loved him, and that love was the reason she was not going to give up on him, even if he had given up on himself. Marcus paused and looked down at his hands on the table. "She passed away 2 years ago," he said quietly. "I was in holding when it happened. They wouldn't let me go to the funeral." His jaw tightened. He blinked several times. "That was the worst day of my life. Worse than any arrest. Worse than any sentence. Knowing that the one person who always showed up for me was gone, and I couldn't even say goodbye." Rachel felt the weight of his words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. She did not try to fill the silence with platitudes or comforting phrases. She just sat with him in the pain of it, the way someone does when they understand that some wounds are too deep for words. After a while, Marcus looked up and asked her about the river. He wanted to know what had happened, how she had ended up in the water. Rachel told him about the kayak trip, about Dana's suggestion, about the life jacket that did not fit properly, about the moment the kayak flipped and the world turned upside down. She told him about the cold, about the rocks, about the feeling of her body giving out, and then she told him something she had not told anyone else. Not Dana, not her mother, not her therapist. "There was a moment," she said slowly, "when I stopped fighting. I was underwater, and everything went quiet, and I thought, this is it. This is how it ends. And for a second, just 1 second, I felt something that scared me more than the water." "What was that?" Marcus asked. "Relief," Rachel whispered. The word hung in the air between them. Marcus did not flinch. He did not pull away. He looked at her with an understanding that came not from judgment but from experience. He knew what it was like to feel so tired of fighting that giving up seemed easier than going on. He had felt that same feeling in a jail cell at 2 a.m, staring at a concrete ceiling, wondering if anyone in the world would notice if he simply stopped existing. "I know what that feels like," he said. "But you're still here, and your kids still have their mum. That's not nothing." Rachel nodded. She could not speak for a moment. When she found her voice again, she said, "Because of you. They still have their mom because of you." The visit ended when the guard announced that time was up. Rachel stood and looked at Marcus across the table. There was so much more she wanted to say, so much more she wanted to understand about this man who had appeared in the worst moment of her life like an answer to a prayer she did not remember making. But the words would have to wait. She thanked him again, and this time her voice was steady. Marcus stood and nodded. He turned toward the door where the guard was waiting to escort him back to his cell. Just before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at her. "Hey," he said. Rachel looked up. "Take care of those kids." Then he was gone. Rachel walked out of the jail and sat in her car for 20 minutes before she was calm enough to drive. The rain had stopped. A thin line of sunlight was breaking through the clouds to the west. She gripped the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the grey concrete building in front of her. Inside that building was a man who had saved her life, and in 6 more months, he would walk out the front door with whatever clothes he had been wearing when he was arrested and nowhere in particular to go. That thought would not leave her alone. It followed her all the way back to Portland. It sat beside her on the couch that evening while she read bedtime stories to her children. It kept her awake long after the apartment had gone dark and quiet. Rachel began visiting Marcus every Saturday. The visits became a routine, and the routine became something neither of them had expected, a friendship, a real one, not built on obligation or pity, but on a shared understanding of what it meant to feel lost and to keep going anyway. Rachel brought photographs of her children every week. She told Marcus about Lily's dance recital and James's first day of preschool. She told him about her work at the school, about the students who made her laugh and the ones who broke her heart. Marcus listened with a focus and attention that Rachel had rarely experienced from anyone. He asked thoughtful questions. He remembered details from the previous week. He celebrated her small victories and sat quietly with her during her low moments. In return, Marcus told Rachel about his life with an honesty that was sometimes painful to hear. He told her about the first time he had been arrested, at 19, for stealing a car stereo. He told her about the years he spent moving in and out of the system, never staying out long enough to build anything real. He told her about the drugs, how they had started as something recreational and had slowly become the only thing that made the world bearable. He told her about the people he had hurt along the way, the friends he had lost, the trust he had broken. He did not make excuses. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply told the truth, and the truth was enough. Rachel also began doing something she had not planned. She started writing letters, not to Marcus, but about Marcus. She wrote to the Clearwater County District Attorney's Office. She wrote to the judge who had sentenced him. She wrote to the Oregon Department of Corrections. In every letter, she told the story of what Marcus had done on June 14th. She described the river, the rapids, the freezing water, the handcuffs. She described the moment he had grabbed her life jacket and pulled her toward the bank. She described the look on his face when he had collapsed on the sand beside her, exhausted and shivering but alive. And she asked a simple question in every letter. If a man is willing to risk his life to save a stranger, does he not deserve a chance to prove that he can be more than his worst mistakes? The letters did not go unanswered. The district attorney's office forwarded Rachel's letter to the county review board. The judge's clerk called Rachel and said the judge had read her letter personally and had been moved by it. The Department of Corrections opened an internal review of Marcus's case, looking at his behavior during his incarceration, his participation in work programs, and the circumstances of the rescue. Meanwhile, the media attention had not died down. In fact, it had grown. A television producer from a national morning show reached out to Rachel and asked if she would be willing to tell her story on camera. Rachel hesitated. She was a private person. She did not want her face on national television. But then she thought about Marcus, sitting in that visiting room in his orange jumpsuit, and she said yes. The interview aired on a Tuesday morning. Rachel sat on a bright studio couch across from a host with perfect hair and a practiced smile. She told her story clearly and calmly. She described the river. She described the rescue. She described the man who had saved her. When the host asked her how she felt about being saved by a prisoner, Rachel paused and looked directly into the camera. He was not a prisoner to me, she said. He was the man who gave me back my life. Labels don't define people. Actions do. The clip went viral within hours. It was shared millions of times on social media. People across the country watched it and argued about it and cried over it. Some people sent messages of support for Marcus. Others questioned the system that had put him in chains in the first place. A few organizations reached out to Rachel offering pro bono legal assistance for Marcus's case. A GoFundMe page was created by a woman in California who had never met either of them, and within a week it had raised over $40,000. Back at the jail, Marcus knew very little about what was happening on the outside. He did not have access to social media. He did not watch the morning shows. He learned about the interview from a guard who told him about it during dinner. The guard said, "That woman you pulled out of the river went on TV and said you were a hero." Marcus looked up from his meal tray and said nothing. Then he went back to eating. But later that night, lying on his bunk in the dark, staring at the ceiling the way he had done 1,000 times before, Marcus felt something stir inside him. It was small and fragile, like a flame trying to catch in the wind. He could not name it at first. He had been so used to feeling nothing, to protecting himself from hope, that he almost did not recognize it when it arrived. But there it was, quiet and persistent, pushing back against the darkness. It was the belief, thin and trembling but real, that maybe his life was not over. Maybe the story was not finished. Maybe the man who had jumped into that river was closer to who he really was than the man who had sat in courtrooms and jail cells for the past 15 years. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not dream about the things he had lost. He dreamed about the things he might still find. The review board met on a Wednesday morning in late August, exactly 10 weeks after the rescue on the Clearwater River. The meeting took place in a small conference room on the second floor of the Clearwater County Courthouse. The room had a long rectangular table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and a framed photograph of the governor hanging on the wall beside the door. 5 members of the board were present, along with a clerk who took notes and a county attorney who sat at the far end of the table with a stack of folders in front of him. Marcus Cole's file was the third item on the agenda that morning. The file was thick. It contained his criminal history, his sentencing records, his behavioral reports from the jail, evaluations from correctional officers, and the letters Rachel had written. Deputy Harris had also submitted a written account of the rescue, detailed and precise, describing what he had witnessed on the riverbank that day. The account was factual, but there was something between the lines that was hard to miss. Deputy Harris had been in law enforcement for 19 years. He had supervised hundreds of inmates on work crews. He had seen people at their worst and occasionally at their best. In his written statement, he said that in all his years on the job, he had never seen anything like what Marcus Cole had done that morning. He described the speed with which Marcus had reacted, the determination in his body as he fought the current, and the way he had held on to Rachel Meadows even as the river tried to tear them apart. Deputy Harris concluded his statement with a sentence that the board would discuss for several minutes before moving on. He wrote, "In my professional opinion, Marcus Cole demonstrated a character and courage that the system he is currently in was not designed to recognize." The board reviewed the file, asked questions of the county attorney, and discussed the case for just over an hour. Then they voted. The vote was unanimous. They recommended that Marcus Cole's remaining sentence be commuted to time served, with conditions. He would be required to complete a supervised re-entry program, maintain employment, attend regular check-ins with a parole officer, and submit to random drug testing for a period of 2 years. If he met all of those conditions, his record would be eligible for partial expungement at the end of the probation period. Marcus learned the news from his public defender, a tired but sincere woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had been handling his case since his arrest. She came to the jail that Thursday afternoon and sat across from him in the same visiting room where Rachel had sat so many times. She told him the board's decision. She explained the conditions. She told him he would be released the following Monday. Marcus sat very still for a long time after she finished speaking. He did not smile. He did not cry. He stared at the table the way a person stares at something they are afraid to believe is real, as if looking away might make it disappear. Then he took a deep breath, and his shoulders dropped, and some invisible weight that he had been carrying for years seemed to slide off his back and onto the floor. "Monday," he said quietly, as if testing the word to see if it would hold. "Monday," Patricia confirmed. She smiled. "You're going home, Marcus." He nodded. Then he asked a question that Patricia had not expected. "Does she know?" Rachel received the phone call that evening while she was washing dishes in her apartment kitchen. The water was running and Lily was singing a song from a cartoon in the living room, and James was building something out of blocks on the floor. Rachel dried her hands on a towel and answered the phone. When Patricia told her the news, Rachel leaned against the kitchen counter and pressed her free hand against her mouth. She stood there for a full minute, listening, nodding, saying small things like, "Okay," and "yes," and "that's wonderful." When the call ended, she put the phone down and stood in the kitchen with her eyes closed. Lily walked in and tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, are you okay?" Rachel opened her eyes, looked down at her daughter and smiled. "Yes, baby, I'm very okay." Monday came with clear skies and a warmth that felt like a promise. Rachel drove to the Clearwater County Jail early that morning. She had not been asked to come. No one had invited her. She simply could not imagine being anywhere else. She parked in the lot at the front of the building and sat in her car with the engine off, watching the front entrance. She had brought 2 things with her, a small brown paper bag and an envelope. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the front door of the jail opened, and Marcus Cole walked out. He was wearing the clothes he had been arrested in over a year ago. A plain white t-shirt, faded blue jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers that had once been white but were now a dull grey. He carried a clear plastic bag containing his personal belongings, a wallet, a keychain with no keys, a cheap wristwatch that had stopped working months ago, and a photograph of his grandmother that he had kept in his pocket the night he was arrested. He stood on the front steps and squinted against the sunlight. He breathed in deep and let it out slowly. The air smelled different out here. It smelled like grass and gasoline and something sweet that might have been flowers or might have been freedom. He saw Rachel standing beside her car at the edge of the parking lot. She was wearing a light green dress and her hair was down around her shoulders. She looked different than she had in the visiting room. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a life he was not part of. For a moment, he hesitated. He was not sure what the rules were now. Inside the jail, their friendship had existed in a controlled space, measured out in 1-hour visits and conversations monitored by guards. Out here, in the open air, everything was different. The walls were gone. The rules had changed. He did not know where he stood. Rachel solved the problem by walking toward him. She crossed the parking lot with quick steps and stopped in front of him. She looked up at his face, at the sunlight on his shaved head, at the way his jaw was set tight like he was trying to hold something in. And then she hugged him. It was the first time she had ever touched him outside of the moment in the river when he had pulled her from the water. That touch had been desperate and urgent and cold. This one was warm and steady and deliberate. Marcus stood rigid for a second. Then his arms came up and he hugged her back. They stood like that in the parking lot of the Clearwater County Jail for a long time. Two people who had been drowning in different ways, holding each other up on dry land. When they pulled apart, Rachel held out the brown paper bag. "I brought you something," she said. Marcus opened the bag and looked inside. It contained a ham and cheese sandwich on thick bread, a bag of chips, a chocolate chip cookie, and a bottle of orange juice. It was the most ordinary, unremarkable meal in the world. But Marcus stared at it like it was treasure. He had not eaten food that was not prepared by the jail kitchen in over a year. He had not made a choice about what he wanted to eat in over a year. The simplicity of the meal, the thoughtfulness of it, the fact that someone had stood in their kitchen that morning and made it with their own hands specifically for him, hit him with a force he did not expect. He blinked rapidly and looked away. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough. Rachel also handed him the envelope. "Open it later," she said. Marcus tucked the envelope into the back pocket of his jeans and nodded. They drove back to Portland together. Rachel had arranged for Marcus to stay at a transitional housing facility in northeast Portland that was run by a non-profit organization called Second Bridge. The facility provided temporary housing for recently released inmates who had nowhere else to go. It was clean, safe, and staffed by people who understood that leaving jail was only the first step in a much longer journey. Rachel had found Second Bridge through one of the organizations that had reached out after her television interview, and she had spoken with the director personally to make sure Marcus would have a bed and access to their job placement services. The drive took an hour and a half. Marcus sat in the passenger seat and ate his sandwich slowly, savoring each bite. He looked out the window at the trees and the road and the other cars and the people walking on sidewalks. Everything looked sharper than he remembered. The colors were brighter. The edges were cleaner. He had been locked up for just over a year, but it felt like he had been away for much longer than that. The world had kept moving without him, and now he had to find a way to catch up. Rachel talked during the drive. She told him about the GoFundMe page, which had now raised over $60,000. The money was being held in a trust that Patricia Alvarez had helped set up, and it would be available to Marcus for housing, education, or job training once he was settled. She told him about the letters of support that had come in from people across the country. She told him about a man in Ohio who had written to say that Marcus's story had inspired him to reconnect with his estranged son. She told him about a teenage girl in Georgia who had written to say that she had been thinking about giving up on life. But after reading about Marcus, she had decided to keep going. Rachel read that letter out loud, and when she finished, Marcus turned his face toward the window and said nothing for several miles. Second Bridge was a 3-story building on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The director, a woman named Sandra Okafor, met them at the front door. She was a tall woman with a calm voice and steady eyes who had spent 20 years working in re-entry services. She shook Marcus's hand firmly and told him he was welcome there. She showed him to his room on the second floor. It was small but clean, with a single bed, a desk, a chair, and a window that looked out onto the street. There was a bathroom down the hall and a shared kitchen on the first floor. Marcus set his plastic bag of belongings on the desk and looked around the room. It was the first space that was his, even temporarily, in a long time. He ran his hand along the edge of the desk and then sat on the bed and bounced slightly, testing the mattress. It was softer than the one he had been sleeping on in jail. much softer. Rachel stood in the doorway and watched him settle in. She told him she would come by later in the week to check on him. She told him to call her if he needed anything. She wrote her phone number on a piece of paper and left it on the desk. Then she said goodbye and drove home. That night, alone in his room at Second Bridge, Marcus remembered the envelope. He pulled it from his back pocket and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Rachel's handwriting on it. It was not a long letter. It was just a few sentences, but each sentence carried a weight that Marcus felt in his bones. The letter said, "You jumped into a river for a woman you had never met. You fought the current with chains on your hands. You refused to let go. That is who you are, Marcus. Not what you've done. Not where you've been. Who you are. I will never stop believing that. Welcome home." Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in his wallet behind the photograph of his grandmother. He turned off the lamp on the desk and lay down on the bed in the dark. The room was quiet. The street outside was quiet. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was slow and unglamorous, and full of the kind of struggle that never makes the evening news. Marcus woke up every morning at 6 and followed the schedule that Second Bridge had laid out for him. He attended group sessions where recently released men and women talked about the challenges of re-entering society. He met with a job counselor who helped him update his resume and practice interview skills. He took a computer literacy class in the facility's small classroom, learning skills that had changed dramatically during his years behind bars. He applied for jobs, many jobs. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. Every application asked about his criminal history, and every time he checked the box that said yes, he felt a door closing before he had even walked through it. But he kept going. He got up every morning. He put on the clean clothes that Second Bridge provided. He walked to interviews with his head up. He answered questions honestly. He did not hide who he was or where he had been. And slowly, things began to shift. 3 weeks after his release, Marcus was hired as a warehouse worker at a distribution center in southeast Portland. The pay was modest, but it was honest work and it was steady. His supervisor, a no-nonsense man named Craig, told him on his first day that he did not care about anyone's past as long as they showed up on time and did their job. Marcus showed up early every day. He worked hard. He asked questions when he did not understand something. He helped his co-workers without being asked. Within 2 months, Craig promoted him to shift lead. Rachel continued to be a constant presence in Marcus's new life, but their relationship had evolved into something that neither of them had a simple word for. They were not romantic partners. They were not just friends. They were something else, something forged in a river and tempered in a jail visiting room and strengthened by a shared understanding of what it meant to fall apart and put yourself back together again. Rachel brought Lily and James to meet Marcus at a park one Saturday afternoon. Lily, who had the fearless confidence of a 6-year-old, walked right up to Marcus and said, "Are you the man who saved my mum?" Marcus knelt down so he was at her eye level and said, "Your mum saved me right back." Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense and asked him if he wanted to push her on the swings. James was shyer. He stood behind Rachel's leg and peeked out at Marcus with wide eyes. But by the end of the afternoon, he was sitting in Marcus's lap on a park bench, eating a popsicle, and asking him questions about whether he had ever seen a dinosaur in real life. Marcus answered every question with patience and seriousness, as if the questions of a 4-year-old boy were the most important things he had been asked in his entire life. Months passed. Marcus completed his re-entry program at Second Bridge and moved into a small studio apartment near his job. It was the first apartment he had ever rented in his own name. He bought a used bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small television. He hung the photograph of his grandmother on the wall above the kitchen counter, and beside it he taped Rachel's letter. Every morning before he left for work, he looked at both of those things. The photograph reminded him where he came from. The letter reminded him where he was going. He stayed clean. He passed every drug test. He checked in with his parole officer on schedule. He opened a savings account and began putting money away. He enrolled in evening classes at a community college, studying business management. He was not sure exactly where the education would lead, but he knew that he wanted to build something with his life, something that his grandmother would have been proud of. 1 year after his release, Marcus stood in front of a group of 50 people at a fundraising event for Second Bridge. Rachel had organized the event, reaching out to donors, booking the venue, and creating a program. The room was filled with supporters, volunteers, local officials, and a few journalists who had followed the story from the beginning. Marcus wore a dark blue suit that he had bought with his own money. It was the first suit he had ever owned. He stood at a small podium with a microphone and looked out at the crowd. His hands were steady. His voice was clear. He did not talk about being a hero. He did not talk about the rescue the way the news had talked about it, as a dramatic, cinematic moment. Instead, he talked about his grandmother. He talked about the kitchen table where she had told him she loved him. He talked about the morning he had heard she passed and how he had sat on the floor of a holding cell and cried until he had nothing left. He talked about the years he had wasted and the people he had let down. And then he talked about the river. When I jumped into that water, he said, I didn't think about being a hero. I didn't think about my charges or my sentence or what the guards would do. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about what she would have done if she had been standing on that bank. And I knew she would have jumped. So I jumped. He paused and looked at Rachel, who was sitting in the front row with tears running down her face. That woman right there, Marcus continued. She came to visit me in jail. She wrote letters for me. She fought for me. She believed in me before I believed in myself. People ask me all the time what it felt like to save someone's life. But the truth is, she saved mine. She looked at me and saw a person. Not a number, not a charge, not a jumpsuit. A person. And when someone sees you like that, when someone refuses to give up on you even when you've given up on yourself, it changes something inside you. It wakes something up. The room was completely silent. Not a chair creaked, not a glass clinked. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the man at the podium in the dark blue suit. Marcus continued, I'm not standing here because I'm special. I'm standing here because I got lucky. I got lucky that someone gave me a chance. And I know there are men and women sitting in cells right now who are just like me. They made mistakes, bad ones. But they're not their mistakes. They're people. And if we keep treating them like they're nothing, then we shouldn't be surprised when they start believing it. He folded the piece of paper he had been holding, though he had not looked at it once during the entire speech. He looked out at the crowd one more time and said, My grandmother used to say that everyone drowns at some point. The question is whether anyone is standing on the bank willing to jump in. He stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. After the event, Rachel found Marcus standing outside the venue, looking up at the night sky. The air was cool and the stars were out and the city hummed quietly around them. She stood beside him and they said nothing for a while. They did not need to. The silence between them had long ago stopped being uncomfortable. It had become a language of its own, a way of saying everything without saying anything at all. Finally, Rachel spoke. Your grandmother would have been proud of you tonight. Marcus did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the stars. But the corners of his mouth lifted slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and sure. She was there, he said. She's always there. They stood together in the quiet night, two people who had been pulled from different rivers by the same current, standing on solid ground at last. Behind them, through the windows of the venue, people were still talking and laughing and shaking hands. The world was still spinning. The river was still running. But for Marcus Cole and Rachel Meadows, the rapids were behind them, and the water ahead was calm. 6 months later, Marcus was accepted into a full degree program at Portland State University. He studied social work, driven by a desire to help people who had been where he had been. He volunteered at Second Bridge on weekends, mentoring newly released inmates, sitting with them the way Rachel had sat with him, listening without judgment, believing without condition. Rachel continued teaching. She won a district award for her work with at-risk students. She credited Marcus with inspiring her to look beyond the surface of the children in her classroom, to see the potential hiding behind the problems. Lily started calling Marcus Uncle Mark. James drew him pictures at school and insisted on mailing them to his apartment. The GoFundMe money funded Marcus's education and helped him establish a small scholarship for formerly incarcerated individuals pursuing higher education. He named the scholarship the Loretta Cole Foundation, after the woman who had never stopped believing in him. In the end, the story of Marcus Cole and Rachel Meadows was not about a rescue. It was about what happens after the rescue. It was about two people who met in the worst possible circumstances and chose to see the best in each other. It was about the belief that no one is beyond saving, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the last person the world would expect. Marcus had jumped into a river with chains on his hands and pulled a stranger to safety. But the real rescue, the one that mattered most, was not the one that happened in the water. It was the one that happened afterward, slowly and quietly. One visit and one letter and one ordinary day at a time. And if you are listening to this story and you feel like you are drowning, if you feel like the current is too strong and your arms are too tired and there is no one standing on the bank, then let this story remind you of something. Help sometimes comes from the place you least expect it. Hope sometimes wears an orange jumpsuit, and the person who reaches for you when you are sinking might just be someone who knows exactly what it feels like to go under. Hold on. Someone is coming.